A Chinese tanker cuts through the Strait of Hormuz. U.S. Navy vessels are watching. Washington has declared a blockade, and Beijing has just blinked. Or has it? This is not a drill. This is not a simulation. What is unfolding right now in the waters between Iran and the open ocean could set the course for the biggest geopolitical collision of the decade. We are talking about a U.S. naval blockade, a defiant Chinese supertanker, a Trump sea summit hanging by a thread, and a world one miscalculation away from something far worse. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 72 hours could change everything. Let's go back to Monday morning, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. The United States military activates a full maritime blockade of Iranian ports, targeting every vessel entering or exiting Iranian waters along the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. This is a dramatic, historic move. The last time the United States imposed anything close to this level of maritime pressure in this region, the consequences reverberated for years. In the first 24 hours, the blockade appears to be working. 6 vessels receive formal warnings from U.S. naval forces. 5 are carrying oil. All 6 comply. Turn around, stand down. Washington declares the operation a success, at least on paper. But then comes Tuesday. A vessel called the rich Starry, a Chinese-flagged tanker already under U.S. sanctions, enters the Strait of Hormuz. It does not stop. It does not turn around. According to shipping data from LSEG and Kepler, cited by Reuters, the rich Starry becomes the first vessel to transit the strait and exit the Gulf since the blockade began. One ship. But the message it sends is seismic. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is. At its narrowest point, the strait is just 21 miles wide. Yet, according to open source analysis, roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply passes through this single choke point every single day. For China, specifically, the stakes are even higher. Analytics firm Kepler reports that Gulf states supplied 42% of China's crude oil imports last year. Iran alone accounted for around 12%. 12% doesn't sound like much until you realize that China is the world's largest oil importer. 12% of Chinese crude is not a rounding error. It is a lifeline. Now, the U.S. Navy is sitting on that lifeline. Enforcing a blockade in this environment is no simple task. The strait is narrow, yes, but it is also one of the busiest maritime corridors on the planet. Dozens of vessels transit daily. Distinguishing sanctioned tankers from compliant ones requires real-time intelligence, satellite tracking, and the willingness to physically intercept, potentially by force. The rich Starry just demonstrated that at least one actor believes the U.S. will not pull that trigger. But zoom out from the warships and the policy briefings for a moment, because this blockade isn't just a chess match between superpowers. It has a human face, and that face is exhausted. Reports indicate that inside Iran, 6 weeks of war have already shattered civilian infrastructure. Fuel shortages are acute in urban centers. Families are waiting hours for gasoline. Hospitals in several cities are reportedly operating on generator power. The elderly and the sick are bearing the weight of a war that was never theirs to fight. And the ripple effects stretch far beyond Iranian borders. According to Bloomberg, China has already begun tapping commercial oil reserves held by state refiners, including Sinopec and CNPC. These are emergency buffers. You don't touch them unless you're genuinely worried about what comes next. In Asian markets, energy prices are spiking. Shipping insurance rates in the Gulf are, according to industry sources, surging to levels not seen since the height of the tanker wars in the 1980s. Every day the blockade holds, ordinary people, from a factory worker in Guangzhou to a truck driver in Tehran, feel it in their wallets, in their workplaces, in their lives. Now let's talk strategy, because this is where the story gets genuinely dangerous. China has spent the entirety of this 6-week war trying to walk a razor's edge, publicly neutral, privately supportive of stability, carefully avoiding any move that would force a direct confrontation with Washington, while quietly continuing to purchase Iranian oil at heavily discounted wartime prices. Analysts call this posture strategic ambiguity, and according to Jesse Marks, founder of Washington-based Rela Research and Advisory, that posture is now collapsing. As Marks told the South China Morning Post, and I want to be precise here, the longer the blockade holds, the harder it becomes for China to maintain its position between Washington and Tehran. China's foreign ministry has already condemned the blockade in unusually sharp language, calling it dangerous and irresponsible, and warning it will only worsen conflicts. Spokesman Guo Jiakun urged all parties to remain calm and pointed to a fragile ceasefire that the blockade now threatens to unravel. But here's the core tension Beijing faces. If China formally challenges the blockade, if it escorts its tankers with naval vessels, or publicly sanctions U.S. behavior at the United Nations Security Council, it risks a direct confrontation with Washington just weeks before a potentially historic summit. If it backs down, it signals to the world, and to Tehran, that its commitments mean nothing under pressure. Either path is costly, either path carries risk, which brings us to the summit. May 14th and 15th. Beijing, Donald Trump and Xi Jinping face to face. On Tuesday, Trump met with U.S. Ambassador to China David Perdue to prepare for what would be one of the most consequential bilateral meetings in recent history. On the same day, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was publicly turning up the heat. He accused China of being, in his words, an unreliable global partner for stockpiling Iranian oil during the war. His message to Beijing was blunt. Chinese tankers carrying Iranian oil will be blocked. They can get oil, not Iranian oil, Bessent told reporters. The timing is not coincidental. Analyst Jesse Marks put it plainly. Trump wants to walk into Beijing with a chokehold on something China needs so he can trade relief for concessions, rare earths, trade terms, political cooperation on Iran. The blockade in this reading is not just a military operation, it is a negotiating weapon. But Beijing is not a passive player in this game. Jin Liangxiang, a senior fellow at the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies, issued what amounts to a quiet warning. If the Strait of Hormuz crisis has not been resolved before the summit, the likelihood of Trump making that trip drops significantly. And here is the detail that should stop everyone cold. Beijing has not yet formally confirmed the summit. The White House announced it in March. China has remained conspicuously silent on the details. Is that silence strategic patience? Or is it the early warning signal of a summit that may never happen? Step back even further and the picture becomes genuinely alarming. We have a 6-week-old war in the Middle East, whose ceasefire is described by Chinese officials as fragile. We have a U.S. naval blockade of a major energy producer. We have a sanctioned Chinese tanker openly defying that blockade. We have the world's 2 largest economies on a collision course just weeks before a summit that was supposed to reduce tensions. And underneath all of this, we have energy markets that are already stressed, a global economy that cannot absorb another oil shock without consequence, and military forces from multiple nations operating in close proximity in one of the world's most contested waterways. Open source analysts and defense observers watching this situation are noting something significant. The rich Starry incident did not result in interdiction. The U.S. let it through, or was unable to stop it. That calculation, repeated across dozens of tankers, could render the blockade meaningless within days. And a blockade that is called but cannot be enforced is something potentially more dangerous than no blockade at all. It is a humiliation that demands a response. So here is where we stand tonight. A Chinese tanker has defied the most significant U.S. naval action in the Gulf in a generation. Beijing is watching, calculating, and, for now, not blinking. A summit that could define the next decade of U.S.-China relations is hanging in the balance, and a fragile ceasefire in the Middle East is under pressure from every direction. The question is no longer whether this situation is dangerous. It clearly is. The question is, who moves first? Does Washington intercept the next Chinese tanker and risk turning a blockade into a confrontation? Does Beijing formally escort its vessels through the strait and turn a defiance into a declaration? Or does some backroom agreement get reached before May 14th that pulls both sides back from the edge? Because if it doesn't, if these 2 powers cannot find an off-ramp in the next few weeks, what begins as a blockade could become something no one in any capital in any language is ready to manage. Watch this space, and we'll be watching it with you.